Please welcome the panel on Innovations to Build Food Resiliency, moderated by Director of Feeding Change at the Milken Institute, Holly Freishtat.
Good afternoon. I'm Holly Freishtat, Director of Feeding Change from the Milken Institute. Today we'll be discussing innovations to build food resiliency. To talk about these issues, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. Please refer to the bios for more details. So we have, to my left, Sunny Verghese, co-founder and group CEO, Olam International. Welcome. We have Pier, Luigi, Sigismondi, President and Food and Beverage Group, Dole Sunshine Company. Welcome.
Well done.
Ian Roberts.
Easier.
Much easier. Chief Technology Officer, Bühler Group. And then Beverley Postma, CEO of Grow Asia. Welcome all. So I want to take a few minutes to level set and explain definitions and context, and then we'll jump right into some questions. So we hear a lot of the words sustainability, food, and sustainability, but only recently have we really started to hear the terminology food resiliency, right? And I want to explain what food resiliency is and what does a global resilient food system look like. It's the ability to prepare for threats, absorb the impacts, recover, adapt from the shocks of the food system, right? So we have been living this for years now, 3 years. We've seen lots of shocks, right? So we've had the shock of the pandemic, which has been health. And with that, it's been a long shock. It's been over 2 years. So we've seen multiple disruptions to our food systems. You know, climate-related hurricanes and more disruptions from climate. We're seeing geopolitical, right? The war in Ukraine, supply chains. And then also we're seeing a lot of increased food insecurity and hunger at the same time as we're seeing a lot of climate pressures on how do we produce our food, how do we be more efficient. And so what I would like to do here is talk about what these issues are. Have they gotten better or worse? We've seen a lot of disruption, and what I think we'll be discussing right now is what has happened as a result of this disruption. What innovations have come out of this, and what are some of the key issues? So I'm going to just start right to my left and have you start, Pierre.
Great, thanks, Holly. Well, first of all, when you talk about preparing for threats, we certainly see like the perfect typhoon happening right now. And I know we don't want to be negative and all doom and gloom, but certainly food insecurity is a consequence of climate change. Climate change has driven hyperinflation. Hyperinflation has put pressure on us from a business point of view to maintain, if not reduce, profits. And that at the same time creates an impact to stakeholders, farmers, and all the partners that we have in our business, which at the same time creates more of food insecurity. So we, in the last 3 years, have realized that we have to break this cycle and then position ourselves as a company that is prepared for the worst, but also hoping for the best. And in that sense, we have started actually looking at the business from a sustainability standpoint, not just because it's the good thing to do, but it's because that's what makes us more resilient. So attacking food insecurity means working very hard to reach 1 billion consumers with good nutrition. That means that we have to come up with clean labels and then be determined as a food company not to have any added sugar in our products, because that is actually the mission that we have. To add more nutrition and to have access to good nutrition to the world, we certainly need to look at our supply chains and then see how we can reduce any waste or side streams that we leave behind, which then makes us committed to actually attack carbon emissions. So being net zero by 2025 in our operations. Originally it was 2030. So we said, how can we bring it forward? Reducing waste by 230,000 tons in just 1 year. So we are actually approaching our business in a way that we believe that creates value for stakeholders, value for our shareholders, but at the same time makes the business much more resilient. Now, to do that, we have to break from the conventional wisdom of how you actually do business, which is through partnerships. Bühler and Dole are certainly working together in this quest. We're having millennials participate in our advisory boards. We are building an ecosystem with startups, and we believe that by having outside innovation in, we can certainly disrupt ourselves in a way that we can be even more resilient as a business. Now, for that, you need legitimacy, you need to walk the talk, and we can talk more about that later.
Yeah, we definitely will get to that. Sunny, I would like you to respond to sort of disruptions into the food system and how you're starting to build resiliency in your company.
Thank you, Holly. So firstly, to just answer the second part of your last question, clearly we are in a far worse shape today than we were in the past. So this year, we know that there are 345 million people facing level C stage of food insecurity, and this was about 135 million people pre-COVID. That means these folks cannot survive without external food assistance. Agriculture still accounts for roughly 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. 20% from agricultural production itself and the supply chain, another 6% from land use changes, and about 3 to 4% on food loss and waste that we incur. The food loss that we have is equivalent to the total greenhouse gas emissions of China, which is the world's largest emitter, contributing to about 33% of the world's emissions. We have 819 million people going to bed hungry every day. We have 150 million children who are stunted, 55 million children who are wasted, and so on and so forth. So how can we sit here and say that the food system has actually improved? It has significantly worsened. We are at an emergency, we're at a crisis, and we need to pivot to a more resilient food system. What do we mean by that? We want a food system that is climate positive. We cannot afford to have the same carbon intensity to produce food. My own company last year, we had 62 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Only 1% was scope 1 and 2, 99% is scope 3. But I've committed to SBTi 1.5 degree pathway, which means I have to reduce my scope 3 emissions by 2/3 by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. And if I don't, the cost to me per year, if carbon is priced at $50, is $250 million per annum, which is about 50% of my after-tax earnings. Is there a bigger priority for me as a CEO, or for my CFO, or for my leadership team and my board, but to really focus on solving for this issue? So how do we do some of the initiatives in Olam? First, we have launched a farmer services platform called Jiva. Using AI and machine learning, we have now developed an agronomy crop care nudge brain based on the specific aspects of that particular farmer. So based on the crop he's growing, the microclimate, the soil conditions, we send him through voice and video brain daily or weekly nudges on what is the next best action he can take on the farm. To just give you an idea, in Africa in 1961, rice yields averaged 0.94 tons per hectare. And after all this time, rice yields are now at 1.94 tons per hectare. China was 2 tons per hectare in 1961. It is now 7 tons per hectare. Just imagine the value that we are leaving on the table by not enabling smallholder farmers to dramatically increase their livelihoods and their incomes and their productivity. So using technology, it is now possible to reach farmers. Farmers don't ingest information because they're reading some literature. They are not that well educated, smallholder farmers in many locations. So we need to innovate to get to them.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn over to you, Bev. And can you speak from the perspective of Grow Asia, some of these key issues?
Thank you very much. And first, I want to say what an honor it is to be joining these captains of industry. It's always a tremendous pleasure to hear from the top of these businesses, because we know that change starts from the top. And I'm honored to be here. And Grow Asia was designed really to harness the energy and the leadership of these businesses. It was an idea born in Davos back in, I think, 2013. And we realized that we cannot solve these challenges alone. Business cannot solve these challenges alone. They need to work together, but they also need to work with governments, and they need to work with philanthropies and the non-profit sector. And Grow Asia is born to create those partnerships, to help bridge those gaps. I look back and see what's changed since we were sitting on this very same stage a few years ago, before the pandemic. And I'm sincerely grateful to the Milken Institute for bringing food to the agenda every year at the summit. I'm also grateful to those of you in the audience that have chosen food rather than the very exciting panel next door on sport. I was rather tempted to pop in and see some of my sporting heroes, but food is my passion, and the numbers are staggering. And sadly, the numbers haven't really changed. We still have 800 million people not getting enough food in the world, and yet we're losing 1.3 billion tons of food due to waste. And I find it very hard to believe that we're still facing this 15 years on. We were making some progress. I think all of the leaders here can take credit for being part of moving the dial prior to the pandemic. Sadly, since then, we've slipped back again. There's 150 million more people hungry today than there was 2 years ago. And there's many things that have contributed to that. But why am I optimistic? Because I am optimistic. In 30 years of working in the agri-food sector, I've seen 3 things that give me optimism. First, we've moved beyond this linear idea of a food supply chain with suppliers and farmers at one end and consumers at the other. We now talk about the food system. And that brings me joy because I see that we have actors joining the conversation that can really disrupt and help us change some of the traditional ways of producing and marketing food. Grow Asia has seen banks and finance institutes and investors join our table. We've seen tech companies join our table. We've seen innovators that have nothing to do with food, challenging us to think differently. And all of these actors can transform the food system, and it needs to be transformed. And the title of this event is Transformation, and I'd love to hear more about what some of these companies are doing in that transformation space. Thank you.
I think that puts you right on stage here. Let's hear a little bit from Bühler Group and some of the innovations that you're working on and some of the disruptions that you have, how the disruptions have helped create innovation.
Very good. Look, our challenge is huge. I mean, it's very, very clear. We want to feed 10 billion people in 2050. We need to do it with 30% less land than we do today. And that land needs to be set aside for biodiversity restoration, for carbon sequestration. And we have a food system that obviously is not fit to feed today's population sustainably. So the challenge is massive. Now, if I come back to your question earlier, what's changed from 3 years ago? We have 3 years less time to solve the problems. That's what's changed. We have less time to solve the problems, and we need to get them solved, not in 2050. We need to get the bulk of the problems front-loaded and solved before 2030. And we have to use this energy and this critical moment that we see to start transforming food systems fast and do it now. And we have to do it at extraordinary scale. Now, the question about innovation and technology, I think we are a little bit too obsessed with creating new technologies. There are an awful lot of extremely solid, industry-proven technologies out there that will make an enormous difference. A lot of it is about how do we think and how do we apply these technologies. So yes, it's great. We can digitally connect value chains. This allows us to optimize on a system level across a value chain. What happens if you digitally connect and optimize a value chain? Somebody loses out. So the issue is behavior and people for the adoption of digital technology. So we have to think about what a resilient value chain looks like. I spent a long time, 2011 and 2012, we worked with the Club of Rome. We founded something in Switzerland called the World Food Systems Center, and we tried to define resilience. And we didn't do very well, but this is what we said resilience was. We said a resilient food value chain is one in which each actor in the value chain can extract wealth. And you define wealth however you want. It may be money, it may be more time at home, in the absence of subsidies with a fair price on resources. And if you can do that in the presence of perturbations like we feel now in the marketplace, then you would be resilient. If you think of digital, this allows us to take out all the people in that value chain who don't contribute but only extract. So when we look at value chains, we have to look at who contributes and therefore who has a right to extract. And that condenses value chains. So that brings us to new thinking around food and food value chains. I know we're going to talk about alternative proteins, sustainable proteins. These are things that enable us to drive major dietary shift, but not fast enough.
So I want to bring a point here. So we see, I mean, especially during COVID, a very increase, digitalization of our food system, right? That we've had to rely on cell phones in ways, and it's made the process faster in some ways, right? So I worked for the city of Baltimore during the COVID-19 response, and by the power of the cell phone, we were able to get online delivery for federal benefits to the residents who are food insecure, and it was taking 12 years, and over a few months, it happened much faster. We were forced, for some technology, some very simple tools. And so, Bev, I want to turn to you for a second, and if you could share some stories of the power of the cell phone, and that is the one step in digitalization, and then we're going to continue to progress from the simple tools to the more complex tools. Bev?
Well, look, I start by asking a question. If you hear the word smallholder farmer, what is the image that you conjure sitting here in a five-star hotel in Singapore? And I'm sure many of us conjure this romantic idea of a farmer in a rice paddy and growing food. I would challenge you to stop thinking that way, and I challenge us to stop thinking that way and think of a smallholder farmer as a small business. That smallholder has no different in terms of business challenges than any small urban business here in Singapore. They need to be able to move their business into profitability, and to do that, they need all the tools that any small business needs. The sad truth is, because they're so out of reach, the farmers, by their very nature, tend to be the hardest to reach consumer of technology. We have to go that extra mile to connect them into digital tools. And the truth is that less than 3% of small and rural enterprises are adopting any form of technology, not just high-tech like drones and the things that we get excited about in the AI world, but any technology, email. We really have to accept that we have to look at the opportunity gap of these businesses that are producing the vast majority, 96% of all food consumed in Southeast Asia is produced by a very, very small business. And at the moment, they feel unreachable and uninvestable in. And so we have to think, well, whose job is it to put digital technology into the hands of these businesses? Because the opportunity is huge. I know big numbers again. Bain's estimated that there is $1.55 trillion of investment opportunity in this region alone just to meet the consumer demands for more sustainable and nutritious food over the next decade. So the opportunity exists, but it's difficult. And we need more actors to be able to reach these smaller businesses. And that's what we do. Grow Asia is there. We have boots on the ground in 6 countries in Southeast Asia, where we're actually putting technology into the hands of farmers. And the crisis helped in this way, because like all of us, those of us that were slow adopters of online grocery shopping or slow adopters of digital tools in our lives, we were forced to use digital, and the opportunity barrier became that much lower. And so farmers are no different. They have started using their mobile phones. Most small businesses, even in the very, very remote communities, have a mobile phone. But we need to help them understand how to use it as a business tool. And we're training farmers, and the fertilizer crisis is a good example. You asked me for one example, I'll give you one. You're familiar with Pinduoduo, the e-commerce platform. Well, that's allowed farmers to purchase fertilizer from a much broader spectrum of suppliers and to look at price points in a whole different way. We were speaking to smallholders who were saying that they first of all found that fertilizer was getting very expensive. They didn't know why. And then they found that they could not find a supplier at all. And that's a huge burden. If you're a smallholder farmer who's got a contract to supply a certain amount of ingredients into a supply chain, and you know if you cannot supply fertilizer to that crop, your yield is going to be that much lower, and you're not going to meet your contracted supply obligation. What does that mean for your income, your family, and your well-being? But by just showing farmers that there is a platform out there that would allow them to search for a broader supply base of fertilizer at a more affordable cost, we're using technology to solve the very fundamental business challenges that they have. And that's one of many, many examples that we can scale very easily.
Pier?
I've heard this story about farmers being equipped with technology for about 10 years now. And whilst this is essential because at least for us it has given us a possibility to disintermediate the middleman we're going to direct now for 65, 70% of what we buy in farms. But I frankly don't believe this is going to change their life for good. I don't think this is going to save the planet and have resolved the issues that we were just talking about a few minutes ago. But I want you to imagine a world where when you buy something on a grocery store, you not only look at the label in terms of what is the nutrition facts, because you care about your health, but you're being told with a QR code what are the carbon emissions that actually have taken to generate and have that product on the shelf as much as you want to buy it. And that becomes the standard in the industry, where you start comparing a dry snack that has a code that says 1.1 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions for every kilogram produced for this product. And then you scan it, and you start seeing the entire supply chain behind. And then you connect with the farmer, and you understand what the farmer is and whether it's smallholder or not, what it takes for him or her to drive that business in Southeast Asia, in Thailand. And then we as a business, knowing that it takes 1.1 kilograms, working hard to make it 0.9 or 0.5, or eventually down to 0, which is when you become net zero from a carbon emissions scope 3 point of view. That, in my view, would reduce by millions of tons emissions that we have in the world, connecting the farmers' technology with ours, reshaping our industrial network, reshaping how we make choices about what we supply from where to whom, and you as a consumer having the power to say, you have the right to be on the shelf because I'm choosing you rather than anybody else. That is, in my view, the business perspective of how technology can shape the way we do business, help the farmer, and help you make the choices that will help this world.
Thank you so much. I would like to direct a question over to you, Sunny, around livelihood. We were talking a little bit, Bev was talking about how to increase the livelihood of farmers and small business owners. Speak to me about some of the core components of livelihood and some of the ways that you're trying to address it.
Yeah, so I know that Bev doesn't like the word smallholder farmers. I can't think of something else. Ian suggested happy poor farmers, which is probably a better label. Nevertheless, I'm talking about smallholder farmers, 550 million smallholder farming households around the world, roughly supporting 2.5 billion people out of the 7.9 billion people that we are today, engaged in smallholder farming. These smallholder farmers, 55% of them are below the poverty line, which means they earn less than $1.90 a day. 90% of them are below a living income. And living income is roughly, as a rule of thumb, differs from country to country, about 3.5 times minimum poverty line definition. So if you have 90% of the people who produce our food not being able to earn a living income, this is not a sustainable system. And we need to focus on technologies, et cetera, that can really improve their livelihood. And that is I gave the example of Africa rice production average yields. Nigeria today produces about 1.42 tons per hectare. Its neighboring country, like Senegal, produces 3.4 tons per hectare. Same West African region, 40-minute flight away, same agroclimatic conditions. They produce so much more than the Nigerian average farmer does. Nigeria cultivates about 3.7 million hectares of paddy cultivation. They produce about 8 million tons of paddy, 5.1 million tons of milled paddy. They consume 7 million tons of milled rice, which means they import 2 million tons, and they have a foreign exchange outflow of between $1.5 and $2 billion a year, which they cannot afford. But they can produce all the rice that they need. They need help, support, education, extension advice, which is not possible in the old model of relying on an army of foot soldiers going and contacting these farmers in rural areas. It is now possible with technology and with smartphone penetration and through voice and video brain messages, very hyper customized to each individual farmer, that has the prospect now of transforming his livelihood. So I think that is important. One thing that I just want to say is all of you have heard from the panelists that, and I think everybody in this room, I can wager some money on that, know why we need to change. We can't continue to hope to feed a 10 billion population that Ian talked, producing food and consuming food the way we do today, because we'll destroy the planet. It's not possible. So we know why we need to change. We also know what we need to change to, as we said, a climate positive food and ag system, nature biodiversity positive food and ag system, and livelihood positive. So one aspect of livelihood is incomes and how do you improve the incomes. The second aspect of livelihood is nutrition. How can you fortify the food that a common person in the developing emerging economies consume? Last year, Olam supplied 87 billion servings of fortified food. But this is not fortified food in high-end packaged food products. This is fortified food in wheat flour. It is fortifying rice with vitamin A, fortifying edible oil, noodles. These are the basic stuff that people consume in some of these developing emerging economies. Our goal is that by 2030, we will produce and deliver 1 trillion servings of fortified food. So these are some aspects of livelihood that we need to focus on.
Thank you so much, Sunny. I'm going to turn my attention to you, Ian. And we've talked a lot, or a little bit, around crops, staple crops. So I want to hear a little bit about sustainable proteins. And what makes a sustainable protein, how the technology is being developed, and is it really worth it? Is it making a difference?
Good. So, I mean, of course it's worth it. Of course it's making a difference. Is it making a big enough difference fast enough is the question. Look, we have to be clear at the moment, the cheapest form of protein in many parts of the world is meat. And meat consumption is increasing. And it's increasing here in this part of the world across Asia as well. And that's inevitable. And it doesn't matter how much we like it in Western Europe and how much we like it when we sit on one of the coastlines in the US, the world is eating more meat. So if I look at this, not through a right or a wrong lens, and I look at this purely through a climate change lens, what do we have to do? We have to drop the CO2 footprint of meat production, number one. Number two, we need to make great tasting, delightful, organoleptically wonderful alternatives. Because I don't know about you, at the moment, I don't pick a restaurant based on the plant-based meat it has. Yeah? So until we say, I'm going to this restaurant because this product's their chicken or their burger or analog is amazing, then we're making consumers choose to compromise on taste and enjoyment. And when we have that, then let's look at it and say, is it sustainable? Is it nutritious? We cannot abandon nutrition. I mean, Sunny has mentioned, the number of people going into poverty, the hundreds of millions who are actually macronutrient deficient in the world. They need a cheap source of protein, and so it has to be affordable and available. And if we drive those three things, then we don't make consumers make a choice on taste. We allow people to change diets in a sensible way. And you can't say it's all about going vegan, because we're not going to go vegan fast enough. Dietary change will take a generation. So if we look at plant-based meats, they're getting better. Good news is they're getting better. They were oversold, overexciting. I think the markets got too excited at the beginning. But now they're everywhere. And their price has to go down. So if they're not mainstream, they don't make a difference. Yep, because it's a climate change agenda. For very few, it's an animal welfare agenda. For most, it's a climate change agenda. It's a rising consciousness of the problems that we have to solve. And the technology is getting better and the technology is in place. I mean, we provide the technology for shaping and forming most of these meat analogs at scale. And because we can scale it up, you can go down the cost curve. We have new technologies that allow you to change texture. We have complete solutions now from dry processing all the way through, which means you can optimize the full protein plant, whereas previously you had to optimize in pieces. So this drives efficiency and scale. But what we're not good at is flavor. So we build partnerships. So here in Singapore, we have a joint innovation center with Givaudan. So you can argue one of the world's leading flavor houses. Fantastic competence. As a customer, you can come to us and you can make the meat analog of your dreams and have it cooked by chefs and understand it. Because that partnership completely complements our skill set. So that's important. Then we're going to go, when they don't taste good enough, we're going to go to precision fermentation because it's scalable, it's known, and we can adapt flavors. We'll go to hybrids, and that will accelerate, again, the growth of plant-based because you'll mix them to move forward. And cellular agriculture, so it's going to come. It's going to come. It's not cost effective. It needs to be scaled. The media is too expensive. The growth factors are $1 million a gram. So we need to find new ways of growing them. But it's going to come because people will want the taste of meat. And if we get all of those right and we scale them, and sorry, for cell ag and fermentation, precision fermentation, there is one prerequisite on all of it. You need clean energy. Because if you don't have clean energy, you don't drop the CO2 footprint, and there's no point in doing it. But if you get those right, we can enable people to change diets without compromising and still choose what they eat and massively reduce the CO2 footprint of the food system.
Thank you. I want Bev. Do you want to speak into this issue a little bit?
You looked at me when the words precision fermentation came up, and it's no secret I am backing that particular horse in the race to the alternatives. I want to go back to this idea of transformation, and I'm not going to hazard a guess at the average age in this room, but I suspect that we're probably mainly boomers and Gen X's. But I think we need to tap into the future in a very real way and listen to the younger generation and what they are going to be eating, what they want to eat in the future. There was some amazing conversations. We had a food leaders summit yesterday, and I want to cite some of the quotes that came from this group because it really plants the thought of what transformation really is going to look like. We feel like we're ending an era and entering a new one. It feels that big. The level of transformational opportunity at the moment feels like an era shift. Some have described it as the end of the extraction era and the beginning of the creation era, that we've really got to stop thinking that we just grow stuff and chop it down and eat it. We now have the technology, the building blocks at the molecular level to grow our food without the impacts on the planet that we've seen. And with all of these technologies, there's a cost. There is a creation cost to the research and the R&D. But if I have any these companies, they've been doing this for 100 years. They constantly innovating. There's a reason why the big public companies have been around for this long, is because they survive. They are constantly innovating and incubating, and we've heard from all of them. I'd love to hear a bit more about what's going on under the hood at Dole and what's going on under the hood at Bühler, because I know that Olam is doing some remarkable things on using AI technology to look at carbon footprints, and Terrascope, I think it's called. We tend to take our eye off the ball in Singapore because we're so excited by these new startups in the alternative protein space and the agri-tech space. But let's not forget that the big companies are doing this as well, and they've been doing it for many, many years. And they have the scale. They understand the commodity markets, and they're able to understand the volume market for food is always going to be bigger than the tiny, tiny little bit of B2C value market. But to go back to precision fermentation, I believe that plant-based precision fermentation and cell-based meat all have a role to play in the future of transformation. But the one that really allows to put the technology into the hands of very, very small businesses is precision fermentation. Once we've built the technology, you can have a small fermenter in your backyard at very low cost, and you can start moving away from high input growing costs to being able to brew food. Any protein, there's companies that are making alternative palm oil. There are companies that are making alternative oils and fats as well as proteins.
Just build on that.
And we're getting very close. And I think just as we saw the horse turn into the combustion engine as a hockey stick curve, that's going to happen with food in the next decade. So watch this space, but back precision fermentation.
Okay, I'm going to add a little bit there because I think what you say is very, very important. And actually, purely by coincidence, I happened to be in a startup event yesterday with a super startup from Big Idea Ventures, and they forgot to bring their precision fermentation in-home apparatus with them, and they just they came here to show me. So they do 1 liter and 10 liters, but what they've done is they've built the complete software control system for home fermentation technologies. And I think this becomes very interesting because precision fermentation itself, although not particularly new, is difficult to control. And you need to get that control correct. And this is where I think digital and this decentralized approach for households can come together. So it's a very, very cool startup whose name I can't remember, but Aparna, you don't remember it either? Oh, there you go. You see, I was going to plug them on stage, and I couldn't remember their name. What a catastrophe. Dynasite. There you go. Brilliant in-home precision fermentation system, fully digitalized, hopefully solving the problem that you just raised and stepping up to the challenge.
So we've been talking about production, right, of growing food, proteins, and so forth. I want to turn my attention to efficiencies in this food system. Right? We do need to continue to produce, but we also need to be more efficient. Talk to me about the efficiencies that you're working on around waste and innovation.
So if I connect that question to Bev's comment before, we have the scale, but what we don't have today is the healthy margins in light of all the disruption happening in our supply chain, inflation of commodities. And for me, that, ironically so, is like good news. I remember a famous professor, C.K. Prahalad from the Harvard Business School, who in a flip chart once wrote to me a big A, much bigger than an R. And he said, this is the secret of innovation, when ambition is multiples higher than resources. That's what makes a company innovative. And when you look at these startups, what they have is huge ambition. They don't have resources. So on our side, we said, why should we invest in internal resources when we have the ambition, and there are so many people out there that can come to you and offer the efficiencies you need, the reshaping, the disruption of your supply chain. So let's just engage with them. As Ian said before, we don't have to create but leverage the existing ecosystem, the wealth of so many companies out there who are just dying for a market, the scale that we provide, and they have the solution in plastics, in carbon emissions, in ingredients with low GI, sugar content, in everything that we need to make ourselves a resilient business at the end of the day. So we have 58 startups right now, as I speak, working in one way or another to disrupt us and to make us a much more sustainable, resilient business. And that's what I tell my people. We have to disrupt ourselves by having these great entrepreneurs telling us, with our funds, with our grants, how we can actually do business differently. And that's how you actually end up reshaping the way in which you do innovation, because you have many others working for you at no fixed cost, no overheads, no capital, and if anything, is giving you a hope that there is technology out there that can change you.
Thank you. I want to turn my attention to Sunny. We've spoken a little bit about efficiencies and innovations and startups, but we have not talked about the consumer. So I would love to hear some perspectives of how you're reaching the consumer. Are they wanting to see these changes in the food system that we're talking about? How are you adapting the company to do so? And just share with me a little bit from the consumer perspective.
I think Pier Luigi has infinitely more insights about about how to get the consumer to induce and catalyze change. But in our ventures business, we have incubated a venture called which is a purpose brand. So we are manufacturing and distributing and marketing consumer food brands entirely with sustainability at the heart of those offerings. How to reach those consumers, how to innovate and produce sustainable food brands, and sustainability defined in all the aspects of climate positive, nature positive, livelihood positive, transparent governance, traceability, and everything else put together is a challenge. And I told Pier Luigi I want him to come and inspire my team because I heard what Dole does in this regard. And we are not a consumer company. We don't have the DNA. But we have sustainability credentials and edge, digital capabilities and edge. And we want to borrow Pier Luigi's marketing brain and consumer connect to make this happen.
Great. In the last 5 minutes here, I want to talk about probably one of the most important questions, and I would like all of you to be able to speak to this. How do we invest to ensure a resilient food system? How do we share the investment across the system? Where are the bottlenecks, and where are the opportunities? So I think I'll start with you. I'm sorry, you're to my right, so I'll go to you first. Let's talk about investments and what we need to be seeing for the future.
Good. Okay, if we want to see the future, we better work with people that are going to live in the future. So the first thing we've done is we get the youngsters. We have an organization in our company, 700 people. Their job is to hold us accountable to create the company they want to work for in the future. On our executive board, I'm one of the younger ones. We don't represent the future. Our job, though, is to create it for them. In terms of investments, I think we have to invest in a few things very smartly. I love precision fermentation and cell ag and everything, but look, we can build food parks that drop the CO2 footprint of food production by 5–10%, even without clean energy. That means that we can build parks that produce 10,000 tons a day of staple food, saving 500 tons a day of CO2. We have to think about how we design the food manufacturing, because otherwise we'll get agriculture right, and then we just burn all the benefits. We have too much waste. We don't embed circularity. We don't have transparency across systems. We don't optimize energy flows, and we don't optimize scheduling such that we create products that are then much more affordable for the population, and they have better access to nutrition.
Bev?
Well, I think the question came up yesterday is who funds the difficult stuff? Who funds and helps us reach the uninvestable at the moment? Because it is very difficult for any big business to take the higher risk investment that is needed to reach these harder to reach suppliers and consumers. Because remember, these businesses are at both ends of our supply chain. They are suppliers of our food, but they're also the consumers of our future. And if we can move them into the poverty, into the middle income, that's the economic growth engine for this entire region. Let's not just think of these hundreds of millions of small rural businesses as suppliers of food. They're the consumers of technology in the future. So who helps us overcome that high-risk investment space? And the answer is we all do. And that's why I'm optimistic, because the investment is flowing into agri-food. Temasek, I quoted yesterday, has invested $8 billion US dollars in the global farm-to-fork system, all the way down to the smallholder since 2013. So there is investment flowing. The challenge is that the investment tends to sit in silos. Big business and investors and banks are all investing in one place. Governments are investing at the social end of the spectrum. Singapore is creating the enabling environment for more technology. And then you have philanthropies, which are trying to sort of reach the very bottom of the pyramid and the harder to reach. My vision, and I would love to just see us, if we could just find those rainmakers that make that money work harder by spending it together. And saying, well, what happens if we put it all in the same space and shoot for the same goal? Because at the moment, the investment is there. It's just not coupled up in a very sensible way.
Thank you. So we've just spoken about investment, and we've touched on several times. I want my last concluding remark to be around collaboration. right? We know there's a role of the private sector. We know there's a role of the nonprofit sector and the role of government. And we really are looking towards in the future of how are we crossing these aisles of collaboration to build a more resilient, sustainable food system, from alternative proteins to crops to the whole spectrum, so that we can be able to bounce back from these consistent threats that we have seen and use these disruptions for the future of our food system. So thank you so much for being here today. This concludes our session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending the session. The ESG programming is presented by Bank of America. Please make your way to the next session.